31F. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's my husband. The moment a stranger destroyed my wedding and revealed my fiancé's secret 18-year marriage, I was in the middle of thanking our guests at our rehearsal dinner when she walked in. It was an intimate gathering, just family and the wedding party at an upscale restaurant downtown. I was midway through an emotional speech about how Ethan had changed my life when the restaurant door opened, letting in a blast of cold February air and a woman I had never seen before. She wasn't dressed for a formal event, just jeans, boots, and a heavy coat dusted with snow, but she carried herself with unsettling purpose. The restaurant host tried to intercept her, but she moved past him directly toward our private dining area. Something in her expression made conversation at the nearby tables falter, then stop entirely. Ethan was seated beside me, his hand resting comfortably on mine, as it had countless times in our 3 years together. I felt his body tense before I fully registered the woman's approach. A subtle tightening, a nearly imperceptible withdrawal that, in retrospect, was the first fracture in my reality. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "but that's my husband." For one suspended moment, I thought she must be confused or perhaps mentally ill, a stranger having some kind of episode. Then I turned to look at Ethan and knew immediately, from the color draining from his face, that whatever was about to unfold was catastrophically real. "Melissa," he said, the single word somehow combining shock, recognition, and confirmation in a way that made my stomach drop. "How did you—" "Find you?" she finished, her composure remarkable under the circumstances. "Your mother's obituary mentioned her surviving son, Ethan Parker of Chicago. Imagine my surprise, since my husband Ethan Collins supposedly moved to Boston 3 years ago for a career opportunity." The silence that followed was absolute. 50 people collectively holding their breath as my world began to collapse in real time. My father half rose from his chair, protective instinct warring with confusion. My maid of honor reached for my arm. Ethan's best man stared between him and this woman, Melissa, with undisguised shock. "I tried calling first," she continued, addressing the room as much as Ethan. "But the number I have has been disconnected for years. So I thought a personal visit was warranted given the circumstances." "Lauren," Ethan turned to me, his voice low and urgent, "I can explain this." But whatever explanation he intended to offer was interrupted by Melissa removing her left glove to reveal a wedding band that matched the one Ethan had removed months ago, claiming it was his late father's that he'd been wearing to feel connected to his parents. The ring he'd told me he'd put away so that our wedding bands would be the only ones that mattered. 18 years, she said, holding up her hand so the ring caught the light. 18 years, Ethan. And I find out you're alive and about to commit bigamy through a goddamn obituary. That word, bigamy, detonated in the room like a bomb, its implications rippling through the gathered guests. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a case of mistaken identity. This was something far more devastating. My fiancé, the man I had lived with for 2 years and was about to marry, was already married, had been married our entire relationship. What followed exists in my memory as disconnected fragments rather than a coherent sequence. My father and brothers surrounding Ethan, physically separating him from me. My mother and sister guiding me to a private area of the restaurant. Melissa being offered a seat by my maid of honor, an unexpected act of solidarity between 2 women whose lives had just collided in the most unimaginable way. I remember the restaurant manager asking if we needed police, and my father responding that we needed a moment to sort things out. I remember my sister calling the wedding venue while my mother canceled the florist. Immediate practical steps taken while I sat in numb disbelief. And I remember the moment Ethan was escorted out by my brothers, turning back once to meet my eyes with an expression I still can't fully interpret. Regret, certainly, but also something like relief, as if some burden had been lifted even as he destroyed my life. The rehearsal dinner guests dispersed in awkward, shocked clusters, leaving just my immediate family, my maid of honor, and, improbably, Melissa, the woman who had been legally married to my fiancé for the entire duration of our relationship. "I'm so sorry," she said when we were finally seated in a quiet corner, the restaurant having cleared the private dining room to give us privacy. "I didn't know about you until 3 days ago. I wouldn't have done it this way if I'd had more time to think it through." "How?" I began, finding my voice for the first time since her entrance. "How can you be his wife?" He showed me divorce papers from a previous marriage, to someone named Catherine. Melissa's expression shifted from sympathy to something harder. Catherine Sullivan was his first wife. They were married for 2 years in his early 20s. We met after their divorce was finalized. He's apparently gotten better at documentation since then. The revelation that Ethan had not one but multiple previous relationships serious enough for marriage hit like a secondary explosion. The man I thought I knew, thoughtful, somewhat inexperienced in serious relationships, committed to making our partnership work, was a fiction. A carefully constructed character designed to fit whatever narrative he needed. "What else do you know about him?" I asked, unable to stop myself from probing this fresh wound. The real him. "I'm not sure I know the real Ethan any better than you do," Melissa replied with surprising gentleness. "Clearly, we've both been involved with someone capable of compartmentalizing his life in ways I can't begin to comprehend." As the shock began to recede, practical questions surfaced through the emotional fog. Where had Ethan been living when he claimed to be in Boston? How had he maintained separate households? What happened when he told Melissa he was relocating for work? The answers formed a pattern of calculated deception so comprehensive it seemed almost pathological. According to Melissa, Ethan had indeed moved for a job opportunity, just to Chicago, not Boston. He had maintained contact through increasingly sporadic calls and messages, explaining his limited availability with ever more elaborate work responsibilities. "Eventually, the calls stopped completely," she explained. "About a year ago. I tried reaching his employer, but they said he'd left the company months earlier. I filed a missing persons report, but without evidence of foul play, there wasn't much follow-up. I started to believe something had happened to him, an accident, amnesia, something that would explain the complete silence." "He told me his parents died in a car accident when he was in college," I said, another piece of his fabricated history surfacing. "His father died of heart failure 5 years ago," Melissa corrected. "His mother passed just last month. That's how I found him. They lived in Seattle his entire life." My mother, who had been quietly listening while holding my hand, finally spoke. "Did you bring proof of your marriage? Not that I don't believe you, but for legal purposes." Melissa nodded, reaching into her bag to produce a folder containing their marriage certificate, photographs from their wedding and life together, tax documents from recent years, incontrovertible evidence of a shared life that had been ongoing while Ethan built another one with me. As we examined these artifacts from Ethan's other life, my maid of honor was systematically contacting wedding guests, venue staff, caterers, and vendors, canceling a celebration that was scheduled to occur in less than 48 hours. 18 months of planning dissolved in a flurry of apologetic phone calls and emails. Around midnight, emotionally and physically exhausted, we finally left the restaurant. My family insisted I not return to the apartment I shared with Ethan, arranging instead for me to stay with my parents while we determined next steps. Melissa had booked a hotel room nearby, planning to confront Ethan more thoroughly the following day. As we parted in the restaurant parking lot, this woman who should have been a stranger but was now inextricably connected to the most painful moment of my life hesitated, then handed me a business card. "I know this is bizarre," she said, "but if you want to talk, compare notes, fill in gaps, whatever helps make sense of this, please call me. I think we're probably the only two people who can truly understand what the other is experiencing right now." I took the card automatically, too numb to consider whether such communication would be healing or simply re-traumatizing. In that moment, standing in the cold February air with snowflakes beginning to fall again, the future was an incomprehensible void. The carefully plotted path of engagement, marriage, eventual children, and shared life had vanished, replaced by nothing. No map, no expectations, no certainty. My father gently guided me to their car, and as we pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Melissa still standing in the parking lot, looking as lost as I felt. Two women connected by loving and being brutally deceived by the same man. The next 48 hours, when I should have been getting married, exchanging vows, celebrating with loved ones, passed in a haze of practical logistics and emotional upheaval. My brothers and father went to the apartment I had shared with Ethan, gathering essential belongings I would need while staying with my parents. My sister and mother managed cancellations and notifications, fielding confused and concerned messages from wedding guests. Ethan attempted contact multiple times, calls, texts, even a handwritten letter delivered to my parents' house. I ignored all of these, unable to imagine any explanation that could possibly justify or mitigate what he had done. What could he possibly say? That he loved us both? That he had intended to end his marriage to Melissa but hadn't gotten around to it yet? That he'd somehow forgotten he was already legally married? Melissa, meanwhile, had located Ethan and engaged in what she later described as the most surreal conversation of my life. According to her, he had alternated between apologies, justifications, and apparent genuine distress at being discovered. He had claimed to care for both of us, to have found himself trapped in a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. The most disturbing part, Melissa told me during a cautious coffee meeting 2 days after the rehearsal dinner disaster, was how he kept talking about his Chicago life and Seattle life, as if they were separate realities that weren't supposed to intersect. Like he genuinely believed he could maintain both indefinitely without consequences. This compartmentalization became increasingly apparent as we both began excavating the man we had thought we knew. Ethan Collins, his legal name, while Ethan Parker was apparently an invention for his Chicago life, had constructed elaborate scaffolding to support his dual existence: separate bank accounts, different social circles, carefully managed communications, and strategic business trips that allowed him to shift between his two lives. His job in medical equipment sales provided the perfect cover: regular travel, flexible scheduling, relationships with clients and colleagues in multiple cities. What Melissa had believed were business trips to the East Coast, and I had thought were sales calls to the West, had often been transitions between his two households. The practical questions multiplied. How had he managed finances for two households? Had he been using Melissa's income or credit to support his life with me? Was anything about our relationship legally valid given his existing marriage? Some answers emerged through necessity. The apartment lease had been in both our names, requiring legal intervention to remove his access and responsibility. Our joint bank account, fortunately containing only moderate shared household funds rather than our primary savings, had to be closed and divided. The deeper investigation into Ethan's deception revealed that he had been surprisingly careful to keep certain aspects of his dual lives separate. He had maintained distinct credit profiles in both locations, using his legitimate identity in Seattle and a variation with a different middle name and social security digit in Chicago. He had never officially changed his address from Seattle, having all important mail delivered to a private mailbox service that forwarded only selected items to Chicago. Most disturbing was the discovery that he had created an elaborate digital infrastructure to maintain his deception. Separate email accounts, carefully segregated social media profiles, different phone numbers that forwarded to the same device but with distinct ring patterns. The technological sophistication suggested premeditation rather than opportunistic deception. As the shock began to recede, anger took its place. Fierce, clarifying anger that helped me function through the necessary dismantling of the life we had built. I channeled this anger into methodical action, changing locks, passwords, beneficiary designations, emergency contacts. I removed his name from every aspect of my life with clinical precision, as if excising a tumor. Friends rallied with surprising strength, filling the void left by canceled wedding festivities with practical support and distraction. My maid of honor organized a non-wedding day gathering, not to celebrate, but to ensure I wasn't alone during what should have been the happiest day of my life. Colleagues covered my work responsibilities during an extended emergency leave. Former classmates I hadn't seen in years sent messages of support and offers of assistance. Throughout this period, Melissa and I maintained sporadic contact, our unusual connection providing a strange comfort. Who else could understand the specific vertigo of discovering the person closest to you had been systematically living a double life? Conventional support systems, while well-meaning, couldn't fully comprehend the unique devastation of this particular betrayal. "It's like grieving someone who never existed," Melissa observed during one of our conversations. "I keep trying to reconcile the Ethan I was married to with someone capable of this level of deception, and I can't make the pieces fit." I understood exactly what she meant. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, trying to integrate the man who had held me through my father's heart surgery, who had remembered every anniversary and birthday with thoughtful gifts, who had discussed children's names and retirement dreams, with someone who had maintained an entirely separate life and identity with cold calculation. 3 weeks after the canceled wedding, as I was sorting through photos to determine which could be preserved, those with family and friends, and which needed to be destroyed, anything featuring Ethan, I came across something that stopped me cold. It was a group picture from a charity event Ethan and I had attended the previous summer. In the background, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely, was a woman who looked remarkably like Melissa. I sent the photo to her immediately. Her response came within minutes. "That's me. I was there representing my company. I don't remember seeing him at all." The realization that we had been in the same room, potentially mere feet apart, while both involved with the same man, was viscerally disturbing. How had Ethan navigated that event? Had he deliberately kept us separated? Had he experienced any anxiety at all about the potential collision of his two worlds? This discovery prompted deeper investigation. Melissa and I began comparing timelines, identifying patterns in Ethan's movements between Seattle and Chicago. We created a shared document tracking his business trips, family emergencies, and unexplained absences, finding perfect alignment. When he was absent from one life, he was present in the other, with minimal overlap. The level of organization required was staggering. He had maintained this dual existence for 3 years without a single significant mistake, until his mother's death forced worlds to collide through the simple mechanism of an obituary naming surviving family members. "Do you think there are others?" I asked Melissa during a video call 6 weeks after the rehearsal dinner. "Beyond you and me and his first wife?" She sighed, looking as exhausted as I felt. "I've wondered that too. How do you ever know the full extent of deception this comprehensive?" The question lingered, unanswerable, yet persistent. If Ethan had maintained 2 complete lives simultaneously for years, what else might he be capable of concealing? Our amateur investigation took a more formal turn when Melissa consulted an attorney about the implications of Ethan's actions. While bigamy is technically a crime in most states, it's rarely prosecuted unless pursued by affected parties. The legal consultation quickly expanded beyond criminal considerations to include financial and civil concerns. Had Ethan committed fraud? Had he misused joint assets? Were there tax implications to his deliberate maintenance of separate households and financial identities? I was initially hesitant to pursue legal action, more focused on emotional recovery than retribution. But when my lease renewal was rejected due to the complicated circumstances of the previous agreement, essentially penalizing me for Ethan's deception, I engaged my own attorney to address the cascading practical consequences of his actions. The legal process revealed additional layers of Ethan's calculated behavior. He had been careful to keep most finances separate, limiting his exposure and our potential claims. He had never added either of us to his primary credit cards or investment accounts. He had maintained separate tax filings despite his legal marriage to Melissa, using address variations and filing status discrepancies that somehow never triggered IRS review. He was remarkably careful, my attorney observed after reviewing the documents I'd gathered. Most people living double lives leave more obvious financial trails. He seems to have considered the potential for discovery and protected himself accordingly. This assessment, that Ethan had not only constructed dual lives but had built safeguards against the consequences of exposure shifted my understanding of what had happened. This wasn't a relationship that had spiraled out of control or a man trapped by circumstance. This was deliberate, sustained deception requiring constant maintenance and calculation. 2 months after what should have been my wedding day, I returned to work, grateful for the distraction of marketing deadlines and client meetings. I had moved to a new apartment in a different neighborhood, unable to continue living in the space we had shared. I had changed my phone number, email address, and social media accounts, creating distance from the life I had believed was real. Throughout this period, Ethan continued attempts at contact. Emails from new addresses when I blocked previous ones, messages relayed through mutual friends, once even a delivery of my favorite flowers to my office. Each attempt I rebuffed, unable to imagine any conversation that wouldn't simply extend the pain of his betrayal. Melissa, I learned, had taken a different approach. After the initial confrontation, she had engaged in several conversations with Ethan, seeking understanding if not forgiveness. Her perspective, shaped by 18 years of marriage rather than 3 years of relationship, included more complex history and entanglement. I needed answers, she explained when I questioned her continued contact. Not for reconciliation, that's impossible, but for my own ability to process what happened and move forward. The answers she received painted a picture of a man with a profound capacity for compartmentalization. According to Melissa, Ethan described his dual lives as separate realities that he moved between rather than a cohesive deception. In his telling, he had never intended to maintain both relationships indefinitely, but had found himself unable to end either one. The most disturbing part, Melissa told me, was his insistence that his feelings for both of us were genuine. As if authentic emotion could coexist with such calculated deception. This insight into Ethan's perspective offered no comfort or closure for me. Whether he had experienced real feelings alongside his systematic lies seemed irrelevant to the harm he had caused. The relationship I had valued, the future I had planned, had been built on a fundamental falsehood. Everything that followed, however seemingly genuine, was tainted by that central deception. 3 months after the rehearsal dinner revelation, I received an unexpected communication. Not from Ethan, but from a woman named Catherine Sullivan. Ethan's first wife, the one whose existence he had actually acknowledged in our relationship, had somehow learned of the situation and reached out through my attorney. Our cautious initial phone call quickly evolved into a 3-hour conversation that added yet another dimension to the emerging portrait of the man I had nearly married. Catherine described a brief marriage in their early 20s that had ended when she discovered Ethan's elaborate emotional affair with a colleague, not physical infidelity, but the creation of a deep connection built on lies about his availability and intentions. He was always exceptionally good at becoming whatever someone needed, Catherine observed. With me, he was the ambitious young professional with traditional values because that's what I responded to. From what you've described, with you, he was more progressive, intellectually engaged, while with Melissa, he presented as family-oriented and stable. This chameleon-like quality, adapting his personality to match his partner's expectations, resonated uncomfortably with my experience. Ethan had indeed seemed perfectly aligned with my values, interests, and needs from our earliest interactions. What I had interpreted as remarkable compatibility now appeared as calculated performance. The conversation with Catherine led to an unprecedented gathering, a dinner with all 3 of Ethan's significant partners, past and present. Catherine, Melissa, and I met at a neutral restaurant, 3 women connected by the experience of loving and being deceived by the same man, though in different ways and to varying degrees. "This feels like the strangest support group ever," Catherine commented as we awkwardly ordered drinks. "The Ethan Collins Survivors Club." The joke, dark as it was, broke the tension. What followed was a surreal but cathartic exchange of experiences, patterns, and observations. We each described the version of Ethan we had known, identifying both the consistent elements of his personality and the aspects he had apparently tailored to each relationship. "He always hated seafood with me," Melissa noted. "He claimed to love it with me," I countered. Allergic, according to what he told me, Catherine added. These discrepancies extended beyond superficial preferences to core aspects of identity, political beliefs, family history, career aspirations, even fundamental values. The man each of us had known was consistent only in his inconsistency, adapting to reflect whatever would most appeal to his current partner. By the end of the evening, a disturbing pattern had emerged. Each relationship had followed a similar trajectory: intense initial connection, rapid commitment, followed by the establishment of routines and expectations that Ethan could predict and manage. He had created relationships that were fundamentally controlled environments, where his partner's behavior was predictable enough to allow him to maintain his deceptions. "I think," Catherine said as we prepared to leave, "that we all represented something he wanted, but couldn't integrate into a cohesive self. So instead of choosing, he created separate lives where he could be different versions of himself without the complexity of genuine intimacy." This perspective, that Ethan's behavior reflected profound internal fragmentation rather than simply selfish deception, didn't excuse his actions, but offered a framework for understanding them. It wasn't just that he had wanted multiple partners or feared commitment. Something more fundamental had driven him to create entirely separate identities and relationships, rather than integrate his desires and needs into a single, authentic life. 4 months after my canceled wedding, I received a letter from Ethan, not a direct communication, but one forwarded through my attorney after he had apparently realized I would never engage directly. Unlike his previous attempts at contact, this letter made no request for forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, it contained something I hadn't expected: clarity. "I know nothing I can say will undo the harm I've caused," he wrote. "I won't insult you with justifications or explanations that can never be adequate to the betrayal you experienced. I am seeking professional help to understand why I've been capable of compartmentalizing my life to this degree, why I've consistently created situations that cause profound pain to those I genuinely care about." The letter continued with practical matters. He had transferred his ownership interest in our previously shared vehicle to me, had arranged for his remaining possessions to be donated rather than returned, had ensured all joint accounts and obligations were fully resolved. He would be leaving Chicago, he explained, to minimize the chance of painful encounters. The final paragraph contained the closest thing to an explanation he offered. "I have lived my life in fragments, unable to reconcile conflicting aspects of myself into a cohesive whole. This isn't an excuse, but perhaps a starting point for understanding behavior that appears calculated but feels from within, like desperate preservation of separate selves that cannot coexist. The harm this has caused is entirely my responsibility, whatever internal divisions drove my actions." I read the letter several times, searching for manipulation or self-justification, finding instead a strangely empty acceptance of responsibility, without expectation of forgiveness. Whether this represented genuine insight or simply another performance was impossible to determine, and ultimately irrelevant to my own healing process. I shared the letter with Melissa, who had received a similar communication. "It's interesting," she observed, "that even in supposedly taking full responsibility, he's still presenting himself as fragmented rather than cohesive, still disconnected from the fullness of his actions." Her insight resonated with my own reading. Even in apparent honesty, Ethan maintained a certain distance from complete accountability, describing his behavior as driven by internal fragmentation rather than conscious choice. Whether this represented his genuine understanding or another layer of self-protection remained an open question. 6 months after the rehearsal dinner that had exposed Ethan's double life, I had established new routines in my reconfigured life. The apartment I had moved to felt increasingly like home, decorated entirely according to my preferences without the compromises of shared space. My work had become a source of stability and accomplishment, with a recent promotion acknowledging my professional value separate from personal turmoil. Friendships had evolved, some deepening through crisis, while others faded with changing circumstances. My relationship with family had strengthened, their unwavering support during the worst moments creating new appreciation for connections I had sometimes taken for granted while focused on building a life with Ethan. Most surprisingly, my connection with Melissa had evolved into something resembling friendship. Not the close bond of chosen intimacy, but a unique understanding born of shared experience. We spoke less frequently as our individual healing processes progressed, but maintained occasional contact that provided perspective unavailable from those who hadn't experienced similar betrayal. "Have you dated at all?" she asked during one of our conversations, 6 months into our unexpected connection. "Not yet," I admitted. "The thought of trusting that way again feels impossible right now." "It gets better," she offered. "Not quickly, but eventually. I had dinner last week with someone from my cycling group. Nothing serious, but it felt like a step toward normal." This glimpse of potential future openness provided unexpected hope. Melissa was 18 months further into her journey with this specific betrayal, having discovered Ethan's disappearance a year before learning the full extent of his deception. Her careful steps back toward connection suggested healing was possible, even after trust had been so fundamentally violated. My own progress came in smaller increments, accepting a coffee invitation from a colleague without immediate suspicion of ulterior motives, sharing personal experiences with new acquaintances without constant verification of their consistency, allowing myself to imagine future relationships without overwhelming fear of deception. 9 months after what should have been my wedding day, I received a final communication related to Ethan, not from him directly, but from an attorney handling his mother's estate. Despite his elaborate identity construction as Ethan Parker in Chicago, he had remained Ethan Collins in legal matters, and his mother's will had included provisions for him that now required navigation, given the complications of his circumstances. The estate matter was relatively straightforward, but prompted unexpected reflection. This tangible evidence of Ethan's legitimate history, his actual family, legal identity, and connections, highlighted the extent to which the relationship I had experienced had been constructed rather than authentic. Even his claimed orphan status had been a deliberate fabrication designed to prevent exactly the type of revelation that ultimately exposed his dual life. As I signed the necessary documentation acknowledging I had no claim to these assets, a formality given that our marriage had never actually occurred, I experienced a distinct sense of closing a chapter. The practical entanglements with Ethan, financial, legal, logistical, had been fully resolved. What remained was the emotional aftermath, the ongoing process of integrating this experience into my understanding of myself and my approach to future relationships. 1 year after the rehearsal dinner that had revealed my fiancé's double life, I attended a different celebration, my best friend's baby shower, an event focused on new beginnings rather than shattered expectations. As I helped arrange gifts and prepare food, engaging in the normal rituals of friendship and support, I realized I had gone several hours without thinking about Ethan, or the wedding that never happened. This wasn't the dramatic closure depicted in films. No confrontational catharsis, no moment of perfect understanding or forgiveness. Instead, healing had come gradually, in quiet increments of attention redirected toward the present rather than the past. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had evolved from acute, constant presence to occasional visitation. Later that evening, sitting on my balcony watching the February snow that had once formed the backdrop to my greatest devastation, I reflected on the strange journey of the past year. I had lost what I thought was my future, but had gained unexpected insights about resilience, authentic connection, and the capacity to rebuild after fundamental betrayal. I didn't yet know what shape my life would ultimately take, whether I would eventually risk partnership again, whether the caution born from this experience would limit or enhance future connections. But I had discovered that even after the collapse of everything I had planned and believed in, something new and authentically mine could emerge from the wreckage. The woman who had stood shocked and devastated as a stranger claimed her fiancé as husband still existed within me, but alongside her had emerged someone stronger, more self-reliant, and perhaps ultimately more capable of genuine intimacy based on clear-eyed acceptance rather than carefully managed perception. Whatever came next would be built on this foundation, Not the false security of a relationship constructed to reflect my expectations, but the earned wisdom of having survived its collapse and found myself still standing in the aftermath. TLDR, a woman claiming to be my fiancé's wife showed up at our rehearsal dinner, revealing he'd been married for 18 years while building a completely separate life with me. As I canceled my wedding and untangled our life together, I discovered he had maintained elaborate systems to support his dual identities. A year later, I'm rebuilding my life with unexpected support from the wife I never knew existed and a clearer understanding of authentic connection versus carefully constructed deception. Edit 1. So many have asked about red flags I missed. Looking back, there were subtle signs. His resistance to meeting certain friends or family members, his careful management of social media, his occasional inconsistencies in personal history. But these were always explained plausibly within the context of an otherwise seemingly transparent relationship. That's how sophisticated deception works. Each questionable element has a reasonable explanation that only forms a pattern in hindsight. Edit 2. For those wondering about legal consequences, yes, bigamy is technically a crime, but it's rarely prosecuted criminally, unless one party pushes for it. After much consideration, neither Melissa nor I pursued criminal charges, focusing instead on our own healing and legal disentanglement. The emotional and practical aftermath was complicated enough without adding criminal proceedings. Update, 6 months later. Life continues to evolve in unexpected ways. Melissa and I still check in occasionally. She's now dating someone seriously and seems genuinely happy. I've moved to a different neighborhood and taken a position with a new company that better aligns with my long-term career goals. The most surprising development has been my capacity to trust again. I've been seeing someone for about 3 months now. He knows my history and understands my occasional need for reassurance in a way most people wouldn't. As for Ethan, we've heard he relocated to another state and is supposedly living alone, according to mutual connections. The anniversary of what would have been our wedding passed last month with more reflection than pain, which feels like its own kind of victory. Sometimes the most complete healing comes not from forgetting what happened, but from recognizing how it transformed you into someone stronger than you knew you could be.